The rescue of Marshall Crawford required timing, courage, and a considerable amount of luck. Samuel and Sullivan spent hours observing their enemies, learning their patterns and identifying weaknesses in their security. The group was moving slowly through difficult terrain, stopping frequently to rest their horses and check their back trail for pursuit. Crawford's captors had grown overconfident after days of travel without interference. They posted only one guard while the others slept, and their chosen campsite was in a narrow valley that limited their escape routes. Samuel realized this overconfidence would be their downfall if he and Sullivan could strike. At the right moment, the attack came just before dawn when the guard's attention was focused on preparing coffee for his companions. Samuel approached from the north while Sullivan circled around to the south, giving them crossfire positions that would pin down their enemies. The plan required split-second timing and perfect coordination between two men who had known each other for less than a week. Samuel's first shot dropped the guard before the man could raise an alarm. Sullivan's rifle spoke a heartbeat later, eliminating another target before the remaining enemies fully understood what was happening. The surviving members of the group scrambled for their weapons, but they were caught in the open with no cover except their horses and supplies. The gunfight was brief but intense, with bullets whistling through the camp as both sides sought advantage in the chaotic terrain. Samuel's experience from the canyon ambush served him well, allowing him to move and shoot with deadly effectiveness. Sullivan fought with the grim determination of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain from victory. When the shooting stopped, 4 of Crawford's captors lay dead, and the 5th had fled into the mountains on foot, abandoning his horse and weapons in his panic to escape. Samuel cut Marshall Crawford's bonds while Sullivan gathered the documents and supplies scattered around the camp. Crawford was weak from days of rough treatment and little food, but his mind was sharp and his determination intact. He confirmed Samuel's worst fears about the scope of Blackwood's conspiracy while revealing that the situation was even more dangerous than Samuel had realized. The corruption reached into the highest levels of territorial government and included several federal officials who had been bought or intimidated into cooperation. The real Marshall Crawford explained that he had been leading a secret federal investigation into territorial corruption for 8 months before being betrayed by someone he trusted. His capture had been orchestrated to prevent him from presenting evidence to a federal grand jury that was preparing to issue indictments against Blackwood and his associates. Without Crawford's testimony and documentation, the federal case would collapse and the conspirators would escape justice. Samuel shared his own evidence with Crawford, showing the marshal the documents he had gathered during his months of investigation. Crawford's eyes widened as he examined the papers, recognizing names and connections that filled gaps in his own knowledge of the conspiracy. Together, their evidence painted a complete picture of systematic corruption that would be impossible for any honest court to ignore. The problem remained getting their evidence to safety and presenting it to officials who could act on it. Crawford's original plan had been compromised, and Blackwood's organization now knew that federal investigators were active in the territory. Every route to the territorial capital or to federal courts outside the territory would be watched and guarded by Blackwood's men. Sullivan suggested an alternative that neither Samuel nor Crawford had considered. His contacts in the mining region included several independent operators who had been fighting Blackwood's takeover attempts for months. These men had their own grievances against the conspiracy and might be willing to join a larger effort to expose the truth. Crawford was intrigued by the possibility of organizing the scattered resistance into a coordinated campaign against Blackwood's organization. If enough honest men could be brought together at the same time, they might be able to overwhelm the conspiracy's defenses and force a public confrontation that would expose the truth. Over the next week, Samuel and Sullivan crisscrossed the mining region while Crawford recovered his strength and planned their strategy. They visited isolated cabins and remote claims, speaking quietly with men who had suffered under Blackwood's rule. The response was better than they had dared hope. Dozens of miners, ranchers, and townspeople agreed to participate in a coordinated effort to expose the conspiracy. The plan that emerged was ambitious and dangerous. All participants would converge on the territorial capital simultaneously, arriving from different directions with evidence of corruption and demands for justice. The sheer number of witnesses would make it impossible for Blackwood's organization to silence everyone, and the public nature of their protest would force territorial officials to respond. Samuel volunteered to lead one group of witnesses along the most dangerous route, knowing that his presence would draw Blackwood's attention and potentially allow other groups to reach their destination safely. It was a calculated risk that might cost him his life, but it offered the best chance of ensuring that at least some of the evidence would reach honest officials. The final confrontation came on a dusty street in the territorial capital, where Samuel faced Cornelius Blackwood himself for the first time since Cedar Ridge. Blackwood had brought an army of hired guns to intimidate the witnesses, but he found himself outnumbered by honest citizens who had finally found the courage to stand together against corruption. The battle was fought not with guns, but with words and documents presented before a federal judge who had arrived unannounced to investigate reports of territorial corruption. Blackwood's smooth denials crumbled under the weight of evidence presented by dozens of witnesses who corroborated each other's accounts of bribery, intimidation, and murder. When the smoke cleared from the legal battle that followed, Blackwood and 37 of his associates were under federal indictment for conspiracy, murder, and corruption. The territorial governor was removed from office, and new elections were ordered under federal supervision. Most importantly, the conspiracy that had killed Samuel's brother and terrorized honest citizens across the territory was finally exposed and destroyed. Samuel stood in the courthouse steps as the last of Blackwood's men were led away in chains, thinking about Thomas and all the other victims who had died fighting for justice. The hangman's rope that had been intended for him now awaited the men who had ordered his brother's death. Justice had finally come to the territory, brought by a lone rider who had refused to give up when everyone else told him the fight was hopeless. The vicious secret at the heart of the Western conspiracy had been unveiled at last, and the land was free to grow into the honest, prosperous state that its people deserved. Samuel mounted his horse and rode west toward the setting sun, knowing that his brother's death had not been in vain, and that sometimes one man's courage could make all the difference in the world. Samuel's decision came at dawn on his second day in Harmony Springs when Morrison burst into his room with urgent news. A telegraph message had arrived during the night with information that changed everything. Federal investigators had been secretly working in the territory for months, gathering evidence of the same corruption that Samuel had discovered. They needed the documents he carried to complete their case against Blackwood's organization. The message was signed by United States Marshal James Crawford, who identified himself as the leader of a federal task force investigating territorial corruption. Crawford's message included specific details about Samuel's situation that proved the marshal had legitimate sources of information. More importantly, Crawford offered Samuel protection in exchange for his cooperation with the federal investigation. Morrison decoded the marshal's instructions carefully. Samuel was to meet Crawford's agents at a remote mining camp called Silver Creek, located in the mountains 50 miles north of the territorial capital. The location had been chosen because it was isolated enough to avoid Blackwood's surveillance network, while still being accessible to federal agents operating in the area. The journey to Silver Creek would take Samuel through some of the most dangerous territory under Blackwood's control. The mining camps in that region were owned by companies affiliated with the conspiracy, and the workers were either corrupted or intimidated into serving Blackwood's interests. Samuel would have to cross this hostile territory without being recognized or captured, Morrison offered Samuel supplies and information that would help him reach the meeting point safely. The old telegrapher had contacts throughout the mining region from his railroad days, including some men who had no love for Blackwood's organization. These allies could provide shelter and guidance if Samuel could reach them. Without being detected, Samuel spent his last day in Harmony Springs preparing for what he knew would be the most dangerous part of his journey. He studied Morrison's maps and memorized the locations of friendly contacts along his route. He also wrote detailed copies of his most important evidence and hid them in different locations around the settlement, ensuring that some record of his discoveries would survive even if he didn't reach the federal agents. The journey began before midnight, with Samuel riding north under a moonless sky that provided excellent concealment but made navigation treacherous. His horse picked its way carefully along mountain trails that were barely visible in the darkness. Guided by Samuel's knowledge of the terrain and the animal's sure instincts, by dawn, Samuel had covered 20 miles and reached the first of Morrison's contacts, a retired miner named Jake Sullivan who lived in a cabin hidden deep in a canyon. Sullivan was a grizzled veteran of the frontier who had no patience for corrupt businessmen or their hired guns. He welcomed Samuel warmly and provided food and rest while sharing valuable intelligence about Blackwood's activities in the mining region. Sullivan confirmed that Blackwood's organization controlled most of the major mining operations in the area through a combination of bribery, intimidation, and violence. Independent miners who refused to sell their claims faced mysterious accidents, contaminated water supplies, or outright attacks by armed gangs. Those who cooperated were allowed to continue working, but were forced to sell their gold at below market prices to Blackwood's refineries. More disturbing was Sullivan's report about the fate of federal investigators who had tried to operate in the mining region. 2 U.S. Marshals had disappeared in the past 6 months, along with a Treasury Department agent who had been investigating irregularities in territorial mining revenues. Their bodies had never been found, but everyone in the region understood what had happened to them. Sullivan warned Samuel that reaching Silver Creek would require passing through territory controlled by the most dangerous of Blackwood's lieutenants, a man named Carlos Mendez, who commanded a private army of gunfighters and desperados. Mendez had turned the mining camps into armed fortresses where Blackwood's enemies were killed on sight and their bodies were disposed of in abandoned mine shafts, despite the dangers. Sullivan agreed to guide Samuel partway to Silver Creek using trails that avoided the main mining camps. The two men set out at dusk, traveling through country so rough and remote that even experienced frontiersmen rarely ventured there. The journey tested both men and horses to their limits, but it allowed them to cover ground without being detected by Mendez's patrols. On the second night of travel with Sullivan, they encountered something that changed Samuel's understanding of his situation completely. While resting in a hidden valley, they heard the sound of approaching horses and took cover among the rocks to observe the riders. What they saw was a group of federal agents being escorted by men wearing Blackwood's colors. Samuel recognized one of the federal agents as matching the description of Marshal Crawford from Morrison's telegraph messages. The marshal was obviously a prisoner, bound hand and foot and tied to his saddle. His escorts were treating him roughly, clearly intending to deliver him to someone who would make him disappear permanently. The realization hit Samuel like a physical blow. The telegraph messages offering federal protection had been a trap. Blackwood's organization had either captured the real Marshal Crawford or had been monitoring federal telegraph traffic and intercepting messages. The meeting at Silver Creek was designed to lure Samuel into the open where he could be captured or killed. Sullivan cursed quietly when he understood what they were witnessing. He had risked his life to help Samuel reach what they both thought was safety, only to discover that they were heading directly into enemy hands. The old miner's face showed the anger of a man who had been betrayed by people he had trusted. Samuel faced the hardest decision of his entire quest. He could abandon his mission and flee to safety, preserving his own life but allowing Blackwood's conspiracy to continue destroying innocent people. Or he could try to rescue Marshal Crawford and continue fighting against overwhelming odds with little hope of success. The choice was made easier when Samuel remembered his brother Thomas and all the other victims of Blackwood's organization. Too many good people had died or suffered because evil men had been allowed to operate without consequences. If Samuel ran now, their deaths would be meaningless and the cycle of corruption and violence would continue. Samuel told Sullivan his decision to attempt a rescue of Marshal Crawford, expecting the old miner to think he had lost his mind. Instead, Sullivan smiled grimly and began checking his weapons. He explained that he had been fighting bullies and corrupt men his entire life, and he wasn't about to stop now when the stakes were higher than they had ever been. The two men began planning an assault on a force that outnumbered them more than 3-1, knowing that failure would mean certain death, but that success might finally give them the chance to expose the truth about Blackwood's conspiracy. The final confrontation was approaching, and Samuel was no longer riding alone. Morrison stood in the center of the sheriff's office, facing Blackwood and his 4 gunmen with steady composure. The oil lamp on the desk cast flickering shadows across the walls, creating an atmosphere of impending violence. Morrison's hand rested casually near his holstered Colt. While his eyes assessed the positioning and weapons of each opponent, Blackwood smiled coldly as he explained that Morrison's investigation had been doomed from the beginning. The conspiracy extended throughout the territorial government, including judges, marshals, and politicians who were either corrupted or intimidated into cooperation. Even if Morrison somehow survived this confrontation, any evidence he had gathered would be suppressed by officials who were already under Blackwood's control. Morrison listened calmly while studying the room for tactical advantages. The heavy wooden desk could provide cover, and the window behind him offered a potential escape route if necessary. However, Morrison had no intention of running. He had come too far and seen too much death to abandon his mission now. Blackwood revealed the full scope of his ambitions, describing a plan to control commerce and politics throughout the territory. The cattle rustling operation was generating capital for larger investments in railroads, mining, and land speculation. Within 5 years, Blackwood expected to control enough resources and political influence to effectively govern the territory as his personal domain. The conversation was interrupted by gunfire from outside, followed by shouts and the sound of running horses. One of Blackwood's men rushed in to report that Sheriff Webb had been spotted escaping from town with a saddlebag full of documents. Several riders were pursuing him, but Webb had a significant head start and was riding hard toward the territorial capital. Blackwood's calm demeanor cracked slightly at this news. He realized that his carefully constructed conspiracy was now in danger of exposure, regardless of what happened to Morrison. The documents Webb carried contained enough evidence to destroy the entire operation and send Blackwood and his associates to the gallows Morrison used Blackwood's momentary distraction to act. He dove behind the desk while simultaneously drawing his revolver, firing 2 quick shots that dropped the nearest gunman. The confined space of the office erupted in gunfire as Blackwood and his remaining men sought cover and returned fire. Splinters flew from the wooden walls and the oil lamp shattered, plunging the room into partial darkness. Morrison rolled to a new position and continued firing with careful precision. His years of experience in gunfights had taught him to make every shot count while conserving ammunition. Within seconds, he had eliminated another of Blackwood's men. Leaving only Blackwood and 1 remaining gunman in the fight, Blackwood shouted orders to his men outside, calling for reinforcements to surround the building. Morrison realized he would soon be trapped and outnumbered by overwhelming odds. He needed to end this confrontation quickly or find a way to escape and continue the fight elsewhere. Morrison shot out the remaining lamp, plunging the office into complete darkness. In the confusion that followed, he moved toward the window while Blackwood and his remaining man fired blindly in his direction. Morrison reached the window just as several more gunmen burst through the front door, adding their firepower to the deadly chaos. Morrison smashed through the window glass and rolled onto the wooden sidewalk outside. Immediately, he came under fire from gunmen positioned across the street. Morrison sought cover behind a water trough and assessed his situation. He was surrounded by at least 15 armed men, low on ammunition, and cut off from his horse. Despite the desperate circumstances, Morrison felt a grim satisfaction. Webb's escape meant that the evidence would reach the territorial authorities regardless of Morrison's fate. The conspiracy that had terrorized the territory for years would finally be exposed. Morrison's investigation had succeeded, even if it cost him his life. Blackwood emerged from the damaged sheriff's office, his expensive clothes torn and his face blackened with gunpowder. He had sustained a flesh wound to his left arm but remained dangerous and determined. Blackwood called out to Morrison, offering him a final chance to surrender and die quickly rather than be slowly hunted down through the streets. Morrison's response was a carefully aimed shot that shattered a window inches from Blackwood's head. The message was clear: Morrison would fight to the end, regardless of the odds. Blackwood cursed and ordered his men to advance on Morrison's position while maintaining careful cover. Morrison realized he needed to move before Blackwood's forces could completely surround his position. He spotted a narrow alley between two buildings that offered potential escape toward the edge of town. Morrison waited for a lull in the gunfire, then sprinted across the street while firing to keep his enemies' heads down. Bullets whinned past Morrison's ears as he reached the alley and pressed against the wall. He had made it to temporary safety, but Blackwood's men were already moving to cut off his escape routes. Morrison checked his remaining ammunition and found only 3 cartridges left in his revolver. The Winchester rifle was back at his horse, along with extra ammunition. Morrison heard Blackwood organizing his men for a systematic search of the buildings and alleys. The criminal leader was taking no chances on allowing Morrison to escape and potentially cause further trouble. Blackwood wanted Morrison's body as proof that the threat to his operation had been permanently eliminated. Morrison moved carefully through the shadows, working his way toward the edge of town where his horse waited. He avoided the main streets where Blackwood's men were conducting their search, instead using backyards and abandoned buildings to maintain concealment. Every step brought him closer to escape, but also increased the risk of discovery. Morrison reached the old church at the edge of town, where he paused to catch his breath and plan his next move. Through the windows, he could see the glow of fires still burning in the business district. Blackwood's men were systematically destroying evidence and eliminating potential witnesses, leaving behind a trail of death and destruction. The sound of approaching footsteps forced Morrison to move again. 2 of Blackwood's men were checking the church and surrounding buildings. Morrison slipped out through a side door and continued toward the grove of trees where his horse was hidden. Freedom was only a few hundred yards away, but those yards were covered by open ground, where he would be completely exposed to gunfire. Morrison studied the terrain and made his decision. He would make one final desperate run for his horse, trusting to speed and darkness for protection. If he could reach his mount and escape from Crow's Hollow, he could ride to the territorial capital and support Webb's testimony with his own eyewitness account. Together they could ensure that justice was finally served. Morrison reached the outskirts of Crow's Hollow just as the first gunshots echoed through the night air. Orange flames flickered in the darkness near the center of town, and the acrid smell of smoke drifted on the desert wind. Blackwood's men had arrived ahead of him and were already implementing their plan to eliminate witnesses and destroy evidence, leaving his horse tied in a grove of cottonwood trees. Morrison approached the town on foot. The sounds of breaking glass and shouting voices told him that Blackwood's forces were conducting a systematic operation to intimidate or eliminate anyone who might have spoken with him. Morrison realized that his investigation had put innocent people in mortal danger. The first building Morrison reached was the livery stable, where he found Pete's body lying in the hay. The old man had been shot twice in the chest, probably while trying to flee. Morrison felt a surge of anger and guilt. Pete had been killed simply for helping him, and his death was a clear message about what happened to people who cooperated with outside investigators. Morrison made his way carefully through the back alleys toward the main street. Through windows and doorways, he could see Blackwood's men systematically searching buildings and intimidating residents. Some townspeople were being forced from their homes at gunpoint, while others had barricaded themselves inside and were refusing to come out. The Golden Horse Saloon was in flames, and Morrison could see Dutch's body lying in the street outside. The bartender had paid with his life for the information he had shared about the suspicious cattle buyers. Morrison began to understand the full scope of Blackwood's ruthlessness and the fear that had kept the townspeople silent for so long. Morrison reached the sheriff's office to find Sheriff Webb backed against the wall with his hands raised while two gunmen searched through his desk and filing cabinets. Documents were being thrown into a pile in the center of the room, clearly destined for burning. Webb's face was pale with terror and blood trickled from a cut on his forehead. Morrison positioned himself at a window where he could observe the scene without being detected. One of the gunmen was questioning Webb about what information he had shared with Morrison, demanding to know if any official reports had been sent to the territorial authorities. Webb insisted that he had told Morrison nothing of importance and had not contacted any outside agencies. The interrogation revealed that Blackwood's operation extended far beyond cattle rustling. The gunman mentioned railroad contracts, mining claims, and political connections that suggested a conspiracy involving territorial officials and business leaders. Webb's fearful responses indicated that he had been aware of the broader conspiracy but had been too frightened or corrupted to take action against it. Morrison learned that Blackwood had been systematically acquiring control over transportation routes, mining rights, and political influence throughout the territory. The cattle rustling operation provided both profits and cover for these larger activities. Blackwood was essentially building a criminal empire that would control commerce and governance across a vast area. The situation became more urgent when one of the gunmen mentioned that Blackwood himself would arrive soon to personally oversee the cleanup operation. Morrison realized that this might be his only opportunity to confront the man directly and gather the evidence needed to expose the full conspiracy. However, the odds were heavily against him. With at least 20 armed men under Blackwood's command, Morrison decided to create a diversion that would draw some of Blackwood's men away from the sheriff's office and give him a better opportunity to act. He made his way to the hotel, where he could see more of Blackwood's forces searching rooms and threatening the desk clerk. Morrison used matches from his pocket to start a small fire in an abandoned shed behind the hotel. The fire quickly drew the attention of several gunmen, who rushed to investigate the new threat. Morrison used the confusion to slip back toward the sheriff's office, where he found only one guard remaining with Webb. Morrison approached silently from behind and struck the guard unconscious with the butt of his revolver. Webb stared at Morrison in amazement, clearly surprised to see him alive and in town. Morrison quickly explained that he needed Webb's help to gather evidence against Blackwood's operation before more innocent people were killed. Webb's initial response was fear and reluctance, but the sight of the burning town and dead neighbors gradually strengthened his resolve. Webb revealed that he had been keeping a secret record of Blackwood's activities in a hidden safe behind his office. The documents included correspondence with corrupt territorial officials, records of bribes paid to various authorities, and detailed accounts of the cattle rustling operations profits. Webb had been collecting this evidence as insurance against Blackwood, but had been too frightened to act on it. Morrison and Webb worked quickly to gather the hidden documents while listening for the approach of Blackwood's men. The evidence was even more extensive than Morrison had hoped, documenting not only the cattle rustling but also illegal mining operations, election fraud, and the systematic corruption of territorial law enforcement. The conspiracy reached all the way to the territorial capital and involved prominent politicians and business leaders. The sound of approaching horses forced Morrison and Webb to complete their work hastily. Blackwood himself was arriving with additional men, and Morrison could hear him shouting orders to his subordinates. Morrison realized that a direct confrontation was inevitable, but now he had the evidence needed to expose the full scope of the conspiracy. Morrison sent Webb out the back of the office with instructions to hide the documents and escape from town if possible. Webb was terrified but understood that he was now Blackwood's target regardless of what he did. Morrison prepared to face Blackwood alone, knowing that this confrontation would determine whether justice would prevail or whether the conspiracy would continue to grow in power and influence. The front door of the sheriff's office burst open, and Thomas Blackwood entered with 4 armed men. Blackwood was a large man with graying hair and cold blue eyes that reflected intelligence and ruthless determination. He wore expensive clothes and carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to having his orders obeyed without question. Blackwood's voice was calm and controlled as he addressed Morrison, acknowledging that the investigator had proven more resourceful than expected. However, Blackwood made it clear that Morrison's investigation had now reached its end. The town of Crow's Hollow would witness the final resolution of this conflict, and only 1 man would leave alive. Morrison woke before dawn to the sound of horses moving through the street below. Peering through the curtains, he saw 3 riders heading north out of town, moving with the urgency of men carrying an important message. He dressed quickly, strapped on his gun belt, and made his way quietly down to the hotel lobby. The desk clerk was asleep in his chair, and Morrison slipped past without waking him. Outside, the pre-dawn air was cool and still. Morrison made his way to the livery stable, where Pete was already preparing his horse. The old man's hands shook slightly as he tightened the saddle, and his eyes darted nervously toward the street. Pete whispered that men had been asking questions about Morrison late into the night. They wanted to know when he planned to leave town and which direction he might take. Pete had told them nothing, but he warned Morrison that trouble was brewing. Someone was clearly planning an ambush along whichever route Morrison chose to take. Morrison thanked Pete and led his horse out through the back of the stable. Instead of taking the main road north toward the mining trail, he circled around the town through a dry creek bed that provided cover from observation. His years of tracking outlaws had taught him the value of unpredictable movement and careful route selection. As the sun rose, Morrison positioned himself on a ridge overlooking the northern approach to town. Through his field glasses, he watched the main road and soon spotted what he had expected. 4 armed men were hidden in rocks along the trail, clearly waiting to ambush anyone traveling toward the mining area. Morrison studied their positions and identified their horses hidden in a nearby draw. Rather than confront the ambushers directly, Morrison decided to use their absence from town to his advantage. He circled back toward Crow's Hollow, approaching from the east where the terrain provided good cover. Most of the townspeople would assume he had ridden north into the ambush, giving him the opportunity to investigate without as much scrutiny. Morrison's first stop was the sheriff's office, where he found Sheriff Webb reading through wanted posters with obvious nervousness. Webb jumped when Morrison entered, clearly surprised to see him alive and in town. Morrison explained that he had changed his plans and decided to investigate some leads within the community. Before heading into the mountains, Webb's discomfort was obvious as Morrison asked detailed questions about the town's leading citizens. The sheriff provided reluctant information about the local bank president, the mayor, and several prominent ranchers. Morrison noticed that Webb seemed particularly nervous when discussing Thomas Blackwood, who owned the largest ranch in the area and served as the town's unofficial leader. Morrison learned that Blackwood had arrived in Crow's Hollow 5 years earlier with significant capital and had quickly established himself as the dominant figure in local cattle operations. He purchased several smaller ranches and consolidated them into a large operation that controlled much of the grazing land in the valley. Blackwood also had significant influence over the bank and local government. Webb mentioned that Blackwood employed a large crew of cowboys, many of whom were newcomers to the area with questionable backgrounds. These men were well armed and fiercely loyal to their employer. Webb claimed he had no authority to investigate Blackwood's operations, suggesting that the rancher's influence extended to the territorial government level. Morrison's suspicions about Blackwood were confirmed when he visited the bank and spoke with the president, a nervous man named Samuel Hartwell. Hartwell revealed that large cash deposits had been made to accounts associated with Blackwood's operations, amounts that seemed inconsistent with legitimate cattle sales in the local market. The deposits came in irregularly but were always substantial. Hartwell also mentioned that Blackwood had recently invested in expanding the railroad spur that connected Crow's Hollow to the main line. This improvement would allow for much larger cattle shipments to eastern markets, potentially making the rustling operation even more profitable. The investment suggested that Blackwood was planning for long-term expansion of his activities. Morrison spent the afternoon observing Blackwood's ranch from a concealed position in the hills. Through his field glasses, he watched an operation that was clearly much larger than a typical cattle ranch. Large numbers of cattle were being held in temporary corrals, and the animals bore brands from various ranchers across the territory. The mixing of different brands in one location was highly suspicious. Morrison also observed the arrival of a wagon train that appeared to be carrying supplies for a large operation. The wagons were heavily loaded and escorted by armed riders who maintained military-style discipline. This was not the casual operation of a legitimate ranch, but something approaching the organization of an army unit. As evening approached, Morrison noticed increased activity around the ranch headquarters. Riders were arriving from various directions, and there appeared to be some kind of meeting taking place in the main house. Morrison counted at least 20 armed men gathering for what was clearly an important conference. Morrison realized he was observing the coordination center for a major criminal operation that extended far beyond simple cattle rustling. The scale of the activity, the military organization, and the obvious wealth involved suggested that Blackwood was running something approaching a territorial crime syndicate. The cattle rustling was probably just one component of a larger conspiracy. The complexity of the situation became even more apparent when Morrison observed a rider arriving from town with obvious urgency. The man rode directly to the main house, and Morrison suspected he was carrying news about the failed ambush. Blackwood and his associates would now know that Morrison had avoided their trap and was still investigating. Morrison faced a critical decision as darkness fell. He could attempt to gather more evidence by getting closer to the ranch headquarters, but this would be extremely dangerous given the number of armed men in the area. Alternatively, he could return to town and attempt to build a case based on the evidence he had already gathered. But this might give Blackwood time to cover his tracks or eliminate witnesses. The sound of horses moving through the darkness made Morrison's decision for him. A large group of riders was leaving the ranch and heading toward town, moving with the purposeful coordination that suggested a military operation. Morrison realized that Blackwood had decided to take direct action against the threat he represented. Morrison mounted his horse and began a dangerous nighttime ride back toward Crow's Hollow. He knew that Blackwood's men would be expecting him to approach from the north, so he took a longer route that would bring him into town from the south. The race was now on to reach potential witnesses and evidence before Blackwood's forces could silence them permanently. The dust cloud appeared on the horizon just after noon, growing larger as it approached the small town of Crow's Hollow. Sheriff Marcus Webb squinted through the heat waves, watching a lone rider emerge from the desert wasteland. The man sat tall in his saddle, his black hat pulled low over his face, and his horse moved with the steady pace of someone who had traveled far. Marcus felt an uncomfortable twist in his stomach. He had been expecting this day for months, ever since the telegram arrived from the territorial marshal's office. The rider was Jake Morrison, a man with a reputation that preceded him like thunder before lightning. Morrison was known throughout the territory as someone who finished what he started. No matter how dangerous or impossible it seemed, the townspeople began to gather along Main Street as Morrison rode slowly through their settlement. Women pulled their children closer, and men touched the brims of their hats in nervous acknowledgement. Morrison's eyes swept over the crowd, taking in every face, every nervous gesture. He was looking for something specific, though no one knew exactly what. Morrison stopped his horse in front of the sheriff's office and dismounted with fluid grace. His boots hit the wooden planks of the sidewalk with authority. He was a man in his 30s, lean and weathered by years under the desert sun. A Colt revolver hung at his hip, and a Winchester rifle rested in the saddle holster. Sheriff Webb stepped out of his office, trying to appear confident despite the sweat beading on his forehead. He had heard the stories about Morrison. The man had tracked down some of the most dangerous outlaws in the territory, bringing them in dead or alive. But there were other stories too, darker ones about corruption and justice that came at a price. Morrison touched the brim of his hat in greeting. His voice was low and gravelly when he spoke, carrying the weight of authority. He explained that he was investigating a series of cattle rustling operations that had been plaguing ranchers across 3 counties. The trail had led him to Crow's Hollow, and he had reason to believe the operation was being coordinated from within the town itself. The sheriff's face remained carefully neutral, but Morrison caught the slight tightening around his eyes. Webb claimed ignorance about any rustling operations, insisting that Crow's Hollow was a peaceful community with no major crimes. Morrison nodded slowly, as if accepting this explanation. But his sharp gaze never left the sheriff's face. As the afternoon progressed, Morrison made his way through the town, visiting the saloon, the general store, and the bank. He spoke quietly with various townspeople, asking seemingly innocent questions about recent travelers, unusual activities, and the local cattle trade. Most people seemed eager to help, but Morrison noticed how quickly news of his arrival spread through the small community. At the Golden Horse Saloon, Morrison ordered whiskey and positioned himself at a table where he could observe the room. The bartender, a heavy-set man named Dutch, seemed nervous as he served the drink. Morrison engaged him in casual conversation about the town's history and recent events. Dutch mentioned that several wealthy cattle buyers had been through town in recent months, purchasing large herds from local ranchers at unusually high prices. Morrison's interest sharpened at this information. He asked Dutch to describe these buyers, learning that they were well-dressed men who paid in cash and never haggled over prices. They claimed to represent Eastern meatpacking companies, but something about their operations struck Dutch as odd. The buyers always insisted on moving the cattle immediately, often under cover of darkness. As evening approached, Morrison noticed several men watching him from various positions around the saloon. They tried to appear casual, but their attention was too focused to be coincidental. Morrison recognized the type, hired guns trying to look like ordinary cowboys. Their presence confirmed his suspicions that something significant was happening in Crow's Hollow. When Morrison left the saloon, he sensed he was being followed. He walked calmly to the livery stable where his horse was being cared for, using the opportunity to study the layout of the town and identify potential escape routes. The stable owner, an elderly man named Pete, seemed genuinely friendly and offered valuable information about recent activities. Pete mentioned that strange riders had been using an old mining trail that led into the mountains north of town. The trail had been abandoned for years, but recently there had been signs of regular traffic. Cattle tracks, horse droppings, and wagon wheel ruts suggested significant movement along the forgotten route. Morrison thanked Pete and made arrangements for his horse to be ready at dawn. As he walked to the town's only hotel, he could feel hostile eyes watching his every move. The conspiracy he was investigating was clearly larger and more dangerous than he had initially suspected. Someone in Crow's Hollow was orchestrating a major cattle rustling operation, and they were not pleased about his arrival. At the hotel, Morrison registered under his real name, making no attempt to hide his identity. The desk clerk, a nervous young man, seemed to recognize the name and immediately became more respectful. Morrison requested a room on the second floor with a view of the street, claiming he was a light sleeper who preferred to keep an eye on his surroundings. That night, as Morrison sat by his window cleaning his weapons, he reflected on the information he had gathered. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a picture, but it was more complex than a simple rustling operation. The involvement of well-dressed buyers, the use of abandoned trails, and the obvious network of watchers suggested something approaching the scale of organized crime. Morrison had faced dangerous situations before, but this felt different. The entire town seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. He sensed that his investigation had already triggered a response from whoever was running the operation. Tomorrow would bring either answers or trouble, and quite possibly both.